Hello, BookTube. It's late April, and that means that May is upon us, and May is, among other things, the month for Maybe Midrash, a BookTube event that was dreamed up by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and dedicated to the prospect of talking and reading intelligently about religion, where the theoretical goal of Maybe Midrash is that you pick a work of fiction that deals with religious themes in some way or other, whether it's religious characters like in Marilyn Robinson, or a religious pastiche like the religious novel that I will be reading, I, Judas, by Taylor Caldwell and Jess Stern, and a work of nonfiction, a work that contemplates religion somehow in nonfiction. And those also span the gamut. The one I picked is J.I. Packer's posthumous book, The Heritage of Anglican Theology, just because Anglican theology fascinates me for very, very obvious historical reasons. And when we did our announcement videos, I'm not much for TBRs, obviously, because I'm going to read a lot more than the two books that I name. TBR might have made more sense last year when I did a read-along, but I haven't decided whether or not I want to do any kind of a read-along of these works. But we all did announcement videos, and my own announcement video, all innocence, kicked up a little bit of a fuss because I pointed out what I thought was the uncontroversial statement that if we look at atheism as so-called soft atheism, in other words, people who simply live without gods, what the word actually means, where I don't pray, I don't believe, I don't conform my life, I don't follow strictures or prohibitions. I'm just living without that. I'm not angry at it. I'm not rejecting it. I'm living completely without it. I am atheistic. And all I did in my announcement video was point out that if that is the definition of atheism, and it certainly is, then every one of my co-hosts and every one of you is an atheist because there have been tens of thousands of gods and goddesses in the history of humankind. There are tens of thousands of gods and goddesses actively being worshipped in the world today. And you know exactly what it feels like to be atheistic towards those gods and goddesses. It's not that you're angry. It's not that you're throwing bricks through mosque windows or whatever. It's just that you don't pay them any attention at all. You don't think about them in any way. That's what it feels like to be an atheist. And the main reason that I brought that up was so that you, if you are actively religious, could extrapolate what it feels like to be a soft atheist onto your own faith. I have my whole life, I've heard from religious people, devout religious people of many different religions, who say they simply can't imagine what it would be like to be an atheist. How wouldn't you feel cold and alone? How can you possibly live like that? And I've always wanted to make the point to them that I made in my announcement video, which is that you do know what that feels like. You live with it every day. There are no worshippers of Marduk alive today. Once upon a time, there were hundreds of thousands of them. And it is the most rank historical anachronism to dismiss those people as not really meaning it. Of course they really meant it. They meant it as much as you do. It's just that God is gone. That whole pantheon is gone. That whole worship is gone. Once upon a time it existed. It was very much living. It had temples and manuals and catechisms and feast days. And you don't think about it at all. Not at all. You don't spare Marduk a single thought. The great god Lear of Celtic mythology, you don't think about him at all. You're not worried about what he thinks. You don't sacrifice anything to him. You don't tip a bit of wine. You don't make propitiations of any kind to him. You know exactly what it feels like to be an atheist towards Lear. And that means that has been a point that I've tried to make my whole life to religious people, to say you do know what this feels like. Nevertheless, that was all I wanted to do. I wasn't trying to imply that soft atheism is the same edge to it as hard atheism, which states there are no gods and that it is a waste of time to believe in them. But nevertheless, it kicked up a fuss. And I didn't mean that. You're all my besties. You're my fuzzy wuzzies. So today, I thought I would do a little bit something less controversial, something closer to a TBR for Maybe Midrash. Not my own, although I will read a lot of these books, but just things for you to keep in mind. Because every single month in the American book market alone, which is my remit, that's my beat, that's what I pay attention to. Every single month, In the American book market alone, there are hundreds of religious-themed books. Even if we just narrow it down to Christianity, hundreds of them. Prayer manuals, prayer journals, prayer memoirs, reprints of the Bible in all of its different translations and bawdlerizations and bastardizations, and religious-themed fiction. Harlequin Romance alone comes out with half a dozen of those every month, and there are plenty of other publishers that do as well. It's hundreds of religious titles every month. Every single month. Hundreds of them. It is, in some metrics, and one of the largest book-buying demographics, if you want to call it that, demographic audiences in the whole of the American book market. It's amazing. That's a lot to wade through. And believe me, I know that, because I review about one of those books every single day. Every single day for the last 15 years. Do the math on how many books that is. Of corn-fed preachers or Nigerian exorcists who believe they talk to God over the cornflakes every morning. I review one of those books every single day. So I know perfectly well the size of the production that I'm talking about and how tedious a task it can be to weed through it all. So I jotted down, just for May, some titles that will be of interest maybe for you to read or to avoid. I thought we'd go through them a little for this video. We'll start off with a couple of examples of the most common kind of religious book that is nonfiction. And that is sort of amorphous, gaseous anomaly, inspirational titles by inspirational men and women. They can sometimes be pastors in their own churches. They can sometimes have mega churches. They can sometimes have YouTube channels or whatever. And they never have anything theological to say. They don't really understand their own Christianity even a tenth as well as the least informed atheist on the atheist circuit. They have a sort of a warm, buttery, sunlight on Sunday morning idea of Christianity and a whole bunch of quasi-profound sounding things to say about it, what Daniel Dennett refers to as deepities, things that sound all Taoist and profound, but that aren't really. They don't bear even a single moment of examination. You're just supposed to repeat them and maybe print them for a bumper sticker. And there are two opening examples of those. There are many for the month of May, but there are two coming out in May. One is by Joel Osteen, who is, his face, that horrifying smile of his, they are absolutely synonymous with this kind of book. He has a book called On Purpose, all about, believing in being a being Christian. These are just a cloud of deepities that just has no kernel at the middle of it. And the same thing is true for this next one by a man named Louis Giglio, called Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table. The enemy here is a capital E, and it refers to Satan. This is a book about guarding yourself against demons. Giglio packs them in. If he gives a talk or a long lecture or something like that, he packs them in. It's standing room only in the crowd. Same as Joel Osteen, only Osteen reaches an even bigger crowd. And all on the back of saying absolutely nothing that has any edge to it at all. I've often wondered, and sometimes asked, what devout Christians, informed, scripturally literate used to be the term. I don't know if we use that term anymore, but what scripturally literate Christians think of charlatans like these people who rake in the money every year and who make it pretty clear. I mean, not as clear as some of the worst megachurch pastors, but still, people like Louis Giglio and Joel Osteen make it pretty clear that if they weren't raking in the piles of money, they wouldn't do this. They're as far away from the shabby mendicant preacher that is their technical lord as it's possible to get. I think if you took even one of Joel Osteen's 4 personalized jets away from him, he'd hang the whole thing up and just retire on his investments. But one way or another, you've got 2 of those. If those sorts of books float your boat, certainly I know some Christians who it does. I can't imagine it. I would think you would want more teeth in your inquiry than that, but maybe not. If those float your boat, those are 2 of many such books coming out in May. But then we get, they're fairly harmless. Those books are fairly harmless. I mean, Joel Osteen, a mega preacher like that, they almost certainly won't be okay with same-sex marriage, for instance. They certainly won't be okay with their churches officiating. And they'll have other bugaboo here and there, and they will be down to their DNA behind whatever racist, sexist, border-closing, immigrant-beating Republican happens to be at the head of the ticket. But their books are fairly harmless. But the next couple of books I want to mention are not harmless. And you'll get those too. In any month's religious publications, you'll get those too. The first one is The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church by Lucas Miles, a youngish charismatic preacher named Lucas Miles, who's a pastor and who is dangerous. He is, Joel Osteen, his ilk are not particularly dangerous because they telegraph a mile away what they are. But Lucas Miles isn't just a theocrat. He is that. He very much wants this to be a theocracy. I think that he doesn't even realize that there's any legitimate objection to that. He thinks this should be a Christian theocracy. He would have a whole bunch of objections. He would talk all day long in objections to a Muslim theocracy. But he not only is he a theocrat, he honestly does believe that this should be a country run by priests. And I would guarantee you has never done a moment's historical research into how horrifying that is for people. I don't think he thinks there are any atheists, for instance. I think when he thinks this way, when he advocates a theocracy, just openly advocates that the United States become a theocracy, I think he doesn't think there are any atheists. Most of these rabid rabble-rousers among the lunatic fringe of Christianity believe that people who say they're atheists are just Christians in denial. I'm pretty sure he would think that. He would either think you're a Christian in denial, or he would think, okay, you're not a Christian in denial, you are an atheist, and so you aren't even human. Consign you to eternal flame. I'll do it myself. To punishment that never ends. To screaming that never ends. I'll do it myself. I'll consign you there right now. Or I could, for amusement, I could have one of my kids do it. But he's not just a theocrat. He's also someone who ardently believes and preaches, including in this book, that America not only should be a theocracy, but is a lapsed theocracy. He honestly believes that once upon a time, America was a theocracy, built on what he maddeningly refers to as Christian principles. And it doesn't matter to him or his ilk at all that is absolutely not true. That is factually, demonstrably not true. Every one of the founding fathers, they might have had some sort of religious belief on their own in private, but they are all on record, all of them, saying this is not a theocracy, this is not a religious country. Every one of them. It doesn't matter to him. It doesn't matter to people like Lucas Miles. They don't care about the facts. They just want to be in control. They want to be in power. When they talk about restoring America to the theocracy that it once was, they're not going to be in the pews. They're going to be up on the stage. but in this book, The Christian Left, he's talking about how some churches actually have the nerve to accept a compassionate, socially progressive agenda. What are we all thinking? How far have we strayed from the loving Jesus Christ that we don't stone homosexuals to death anymore? What can we be thinking? When did we stray from the path? He sees this happening. What on earth? Races that are equal? Social benefits for everybody? How can you call this Christianity? How did we let the left infiltrate our churches to such an extent? And what can we do to root it out and get it back to the way things used to be? And the other book along these lines is another one. It's along those exact same theme. It's by Noel Mering, and it's called Awake, Not Woke. A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. And despite the fact that Noel Mering is the author of this second book, the heart of these kinds of books, you will find this call against wokeism everywhere on the hard religious right in America, all throughout the Bible Belt. And the heart of their objection to woke ideology is that it flies in the face of the one single burning bright, shining, motivating ethos of these people, which is the subjugation of women. That is the thing that animates all of this, when you strip away all the theology that they don't know, when you strip away all of the passages of Scripture that they don't know, that they've never read, or that they're ignoring, in order to get to this, militant Mel Gibson marching Jesus, when you strip away all of that, you get to the subjugation of women. If you were to, I don't know Noelle Mering at all. I've never heard her speak. I've never seen a clip of her. I've never read another book of hers. But I guarantee you that if you asked her, are you the equal of your husband? She would say, no, and I shouldn't be. So you have to, if you're going to read these kinds of books for the month of May, from maybe Midrash, you should read them with a good deal of caution, because if you are a normal Christian, like the thousands that I know, who actually takes your Lord and Savior at his word about compassion and forgiveness and inclusivity, then these tracts are going to revolt you. And in one sense, they do sort of fly in the face of Jason's idea of maybe Midrash, where he wants, intelligent is a word that keeps coming to mind, a sensitive, considered response to these things. But the books don't have to be intelligent. Your response to them could be, and it's worthwhile to know what is selling in these quarters of Christianity, because those quarters of Christianity are getting stronger. And the third book that I want to mention in this little cluster is connected to these first two, mainly because it's an example of the thing they hate. It's St. Benedict's Rule. It's a new translation of St. Benedict's Rule by Judith Sutera, S-U-T-E-R-A, that is inclusive. It's a bastardization of the Rule of St. Benedict that is gender neutral, pronoun neutral, inclusive. So it's not an accurate translation. It's a translation according to the SJW politics of the moment. A loathsome project. There have been many, many, many people who read the Rule of St. Benedict who were not white monks and who still managed to be uplifted by it. You do not need to find yourself in what you read. That is a very childish way to read, no matter whether it's the Rule of St. Benedict or anything else. Inclusivity is a very childish demand to make of any kind of literary project. Nevertheless, this thing is coming out in May, and it is exactly what Lucas Miles and Noelle Mering have in mind. They don't want to see this sort of thing at all. They think this is the increep of communist and socialist leftist agendas into our church. So I put them together for that reason, because it's the sort of sociological movement that those two authors are ranting against is real. You don't have to get any further than a whole bunch of signature Christian Twitter threads. Progressive Christians, including, I'm proud to say, quite a few Jesuits, saying, look, let's abandon these stupid human prejudices from the 20th century. Human prejudices have no part in the mission of the church, which is to reach out to all of God's children. I'm sure that was the charitable place that this new St. Benedict's Rule comes from. But nevertheless, it's a perfect example of what those first two books hate. So I thought I'd mention those three. And then I have three more to mention here that also share something in common. Unfortunately, they share a couple of things in common. But unfortunately, one of the things they share in common is an eye-watering price tag. That's the price you pay, literally. In every month, there will be very expensive stuff. There will be by-the-way stuff. There will be useless fluff. There will be, God-made ponies, so, that sort of thing. Something for every Christian reading taste. But the first of those three that I want to mention is the Cambridge Companion to the Apostolic Fathers, which is part of a series that the Cambridge Companion is doing on religion. And this is, they're big books. They're very expensive. They're well over $100. But they're worth having if you're interested in the subject, because they're the latest thinkers. They're really good essays, great bibliographies, fantastic overarching introduction. And the Apostolic Fathers are an absolutely fascinating subject. So you've got the Cambridge Companion to the Apostolic Fathers, but you also have the Oxford Handbook. The Oxford Handbook, we've seen some of them on this channel. They are also the same thing. They are overpriced, hardcover anthologies of the latest essays by really good people. The Oxford Handbook series is incredible and also huge, so there must be a liking for them. The line is now huge. It's hundreds of titles. I've had them for everything from the poetry of Edmund Spenser to ethical treatment of animals and everything in between. And their latest one is the Oxford Handbook to Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian. So this will be great essays on the man and his writing. Fantastic stuff. If you're interested in Niebuhr, then you're going to want this volume, even though it's going to set you back a pretty penny. These are well over $100. I think $110 for each of these, American. And then the third one is Theological Scholarship. And that can be expensive too, because there's not a wide market for it. In this case, I sort of kind of understand why you would price it to make some money back, because theological libraries will probably buy a copy of this thing. But the general public, theological libraries can usually afford it. The general public, probably not. So the third book here is The Embodied God by Brittany Wilson. And it looks to be a scholarly study of the Gospel of St. Luke and also the Acts of the Apostles, with a specific aim towards what the theological thinkers of the day, and also the author of those books, thinks about the physicality of God. Not just the physicality of Jesus, but the physicality of God. Does God have a physical being? Inquiries like that, if they're done intelligently, I think are absolutely fascinating. I'm hoping to get a copy of this book so that I can dive right into it. But I thought I'd put it on your radar as well. I'll have to figure out a way to list these down below. Even though I'm sure some of them I don't think are going to be of general interest. I just thought I would show you a sort of a thumbnail of what even 1 month has for the kind of books that we're talking about from maybe Midrash. So we'll move on from the overpriced books to historical stuff, because that counts, right? That certainly counts for maybe Midrash. And the first of those is by Ambrogio Cainai, I think, and it's called To Kidnap a Pope. And it's about Napoleon Bonaparte and Pope Pius VII. Because when Bonaparte emerged at the top of the heap at the end of the French Revolution, he had to figure out what to do about religion, and what he had to do about the Pope. And it started out as a kind of compact between roughly equally evil men, but it became, there was never any way that it was going to be anything other than daggers drawn. If you've got Bonaparte in the mix, then there's never going to be a situation where he calls anyone Holy Father, or where he goes down on a knee, or where he wants anyone else to do that to anyone but him. And this looks to be just a terrifically fun narrative of that fractious relationship. Can't wait to get a copy. And then the next one's from Oxford University Press. I haven't got a copy yet. I don't know that I will unless I ask for one, because I don't think it's a general purpose thing. It's Karl Barth, A Life in Conflict. It's by Christian Tietz, translated by Victoria Barnett. And it's a new look at Karl Barth, who certainly does not lack for biographical treatments. This is the latest one. This is one that's coming out in May. That'll deal with his life, his readings, his literature, and the long shadow that he casts on the discipline. And the same thing is true of the next one, which is George Berkeley, the great Irish theological thinker from the Enlightenment period. This is called A Philosophical Life, and it's by Tom Jones, and it's coming out in May. And of the three of those, I don't think To Kidnap a Pope, I don't think will be widely reviewed, because it will require the poor little daffodils of reviewers to bone up on the subject, and they probably won't want to do that. And the same thing with the Karl Barth. Karl Barth is a living figure, and that's going to be a little bit more off-putting, both to book section editors and to reviewers. I'd be amazed if any book section editor in the country has somebody on their mental Rolodex where they hear Karl Barth and they think, that's the person I want. I'd be amazed if that's true. But George Berkeley is good and dead. He's nice and dead. And there you pull in the Enlightenment, you pull in the state of Ireland at the time, you pull in his philosophical thought, which is voluminously stated but not complex. That book might be a target for a few reviews. I wouldn't be surprised. I read 20 or 30 book review sections, or full-scale dedicated book reviews like the London Review of Books or the TLS or the New York Review of Books. I also read the New York Times book review and the book sections of places like the LA Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or Big Canoe News in northern Georgia. And I watch those things, the New Republic, the Atlantic, Harper's, that sort of thing, to see what they review. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some of the more conservative magazines, monthly magazines, have a review of this George Berkeley book. I'll be interested in seeing it, definitely. And we can stick a little bit with the historical here. There's an intriguing looking book called Reading the Times by Jeffrey Bilbrough, which is a sort of a theological look at the morning news, whether it's the anachronistic newspaper or whether it's your news feed in the morning. How should you look at those things if you're thinking theologically or religiously? Looks kind of interesting. I'll know in a minute. The author himself is young, but he's extremely well read and brainy. So I'll know in 20 pages whether or not he's writing down to his audience or whether or not this book might be intriguing. Fascinated either way to give it a try. And the next one is a book called Joseph Smith for President. And it deals with Joseph Smith. It's by Spencer McBride, and it deals with the presidential election of 1844, in which Joseph Smith was running as a candidate and became, in the course of that campaign, the first American presidential candidate to be assassinated. And it looks like, to me, like McBride is going to look over the whole period. It looks to me like this is a much more historical approach than a theological approach. And that's terrific. That's fantastic. Joseph Smith never fails to make good reading. Let's just put it that way. Infuriating, hair-pulling reading, but really interesting. And this is a new book on him that I think will probably get a lot of widespread attention. And then we'll finish up. I don't want this to go on forever. We'll finish up with a name that I could hardly leave out of maybe Midrash, now could I? And that's N.T. Wright. Tom Wright, the Bishop of Durham, who is also a prolific writer on Christianity, and specifically on the New Testament, specifically looking at the major figures like Paul and the major lines of post-Enlightenment theological debate and thought. He has a lot of opinions that I don't agree with. I very much like his style of writing. I have a couple of his books in this room. And in May, he is coming out with a 500-page study of Galatians, of the letter to the Galatians, in which, as is his wont, he finds a whole bunch of stuff going on and grounds the whole of it in history, what was going on at the time in Judea and in Rome and whatnot. I know he has his detractors among the razor-sharp theological crowd. I know there are a lot of people who think that he's mostly a fog machine. I sympathize with that view. I wouldn't go so far as one such figure who called him a used car salesman, but I sympathize with that view, but I don't agree with it. I always learn something from his writing, even though it's not all that challenging. I think that's intentionally so. I think he's writing his huge books endlessly. He just writes all the time. I think he's writing them. They're very scripturally informed, obviously, since it was his profession, but I think he writes constantly with one eye cocked towards the general audience. And I like that. I like a religious discourse that doesn't insult the intelligence of his readers, but also isn't writing for specialists. I think that's a fine line to walk. Not enough people do it. A great deal of any month's religious writing is so condescending it makes my teeth go on edge. But Tom Wright never does that. And reading him for, 500 pages on Galatians will be fascinating. I'm sure it will be fascinating, even if I don't end up agreeing with it. So I wanted to put it on your list here. So there you go. That is not so much a TBR as a sort of a look ahead to the month of May. May is when, for maybe Midrash, we will be thinking along religious lines, reading religious-inspired texts, thinking about them, maybe talking about them. If you have a BookTube channel and you are doing some maybe Midrash reading, feel free to make videos, right? Because the discussion will be ongoing throughout the month, and I love that. Absolutely love it. And I wanted to give you this list also as a way to show you that this is what I deal with. This is what I deal with on a monthly basis, not just on the subject of religion, but on all subjects. Every month has a barrage of new titles coming out on most of the subjects that I really like, most of the genres that I read in, although nothing as much as religion, except maybe romance. But other than that, it's a deluge every month in religion. These are just some of the titles that might be of interest to you. If I remember, I will figure out a way to clean up this list and leave a title list down below, because you don't want to be stopping and starting the video. But one way or another, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That was just a little bit of maybe Midrash prep, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.